Hi, philosophers. I want to walk through the next argumentative essay with you and some of the options and some of the pairings that you could do. So you can find that under week 11, but I encourage you to go ahead and look at it and some of your different options now. I have some of the possible philosophical questions that come up. These are not all the questions that are possible. So if you have another question that's coming up and another sort of pairing that you would like to do, even if it's not in our textbook, please let me know and I can work with you to find a particular topic that you're interested in. So for socio-political philosophy, that's sort of two areas that are very closely knit under the broader branch of axiology and the study of values. So the first thing when you look at that rubric is again to define the particular area. So I want you to figure out if you're really pulling from chapter 8 or chapter 9 because they have distinct questions. So political philosophy, more precisely, is anything dealing with the relationship between the individual and the state, where the state is the government. And so that's a very particular kind of question. It gets to what is our justification for government at all? Why would we enter into such a social contract, right? So that's political philosophy, and you can look up other definitions as well, but that's what she's laying out the very beginning of that chapter. So if you're doing chapter 8, right, questions that come out of that, then you're really dealing in political philosophy. Now, Plato can really, his meritocracy that comes up in chapter 8 is also a kind of theory of justice. And so you see that on the chart I have for theory of justice. So you could use him either for a chapter 8 question or a chapter 9 question. But for pretty much everybody else, think about if you're pulling from chapter 8, those thinkers, and try to stay within a chapter when you're pulling thinkers, then you're doing political philosophy. Now, if you're pulling from chapter 9, you're doing social philosophy. And that's the relationship between individuals and others in their community, and this larger question about how much do we owe one another, right? And what kind of things do we owe one another, and what does justice look like? So make sure you figure out, am I doing chapter 8, chapter 9? I have another option there as well that you can do. Gloria Anzaldúa and her essay and argue for or against a particular point that she makes in the essay. So that's another option for you as well. But for most people, you're going to be pulling from chapter 8 or chapter 9. So I want to go through some of the potential questions that you could use to ground this argumentative essay and some of the pairings, right? So again, this is not all of the options that are available to you, but these are some of the more popular and some of the ones that connect with the reading and some of my other videos a little more directly. Okay, so the first is there justification for government, right? So this would just be a very simple pairing between sort of anarchism, right? This idea that we don't need any sort of government versus anybody in social contract theory. So you could pair, right, sort of the overall theory of anarchism with either somebody like Hobbes or somebody like Locke, who are in that social contract tradition, and argue that we do need a social contract in order to thrive as human beings, right? So that would be one pairing you could do. The next question that I have as an example is, do natural rights exist? Do natural rights exist in a state of nature, right? Or do our rights at all exist in a state of nature? And so there, right, while on the one hand, anarchism would be against social contract theory as a whole, you have arguments within social contract theory between people like Hobbes and people like Locke. So from another video, remember that Hobbes, right, thinks we don't have something called natural rights, that we only get rights as we enter into the social contract, whereas Locke believes that we already have those rights, that they are natural to us, right? Those inalienable rights. That's what comes up, at least within our tradition in the States. And so Hobbes and Locke would be a good pairing to argue, right? Do we have natural rights already, or do we get those once we enter into the social contract? So that would be an interesting pairing. The next question that's going to come out of chapter 8 would be, is civil disobedience ever justified? So here you could do either Martin Luther King or Locke, right, because they're in that same sort of tradition together, versus somebody like Hobbes. Even if, though it doesn't come up, you'd have to do a little bit of outside work there. You could do Hobbes or Socrates to argue against that. So both Hobbes or Socrates believe that you always go, work within the law in order to make change. Otherwise, the law doesn't mean anything, and that's very much against King and Locke and this idea that we have natural rights, and that there's an idea of natural law. So then when the law, right, goes against, right, human law goes against natural law, we are compelled to break those laws in order to draw attention to that. So you could do either Martin Luther King or Locke on the side of civil disobedience versus somebody like Hobbes or even Socrates. And again, you might have to do a little more outside work if you're pulling in Socrates than what the book offers. The next one, if we're moving on to chapter 9, is what makes a just society and how do you define justice, okay? So you could do that more broadly. You could pick a specific issue about what would be the just thing to do. So you can use, I have a chart that you can also find with the chapter 9 materials. And I pull in again Plato's idea of meritocracy there, and this idea of harmony. So that's really pulled from chapter 8, but all the other ones are going to be in chapter 9. And so they're all dealing with this question of what justice is. So you can look through there and find two, right, that disagree and figure out which one you're on the side of, okay? And then finally, I have, does assimilation or separation lead to racial justice? So that's kind of towards the end of chapter 9. And then I also have in the review, you'll see, is there a third option, right? Another way of saying that is that assimilation, separatism, disjunctive syllogism argument a false dilemma? Okay, so you'll see in that section on African American social philosophy, Douglas versus Delaney, so that classic debate that comes up. And then there's a little bit kind of on Du Bois and King. And the book, I feel like, still makes it sound like they lean towards assimilation. And I think part of that is sort of the language of the time and what they were trying to achieve. So you could argue that King was on the side of assimilation. I think he was more complicated than that. You'd have to do, you could do a little bit more outside reading and kind of look into his letter from Birmingham jail and find him in some ways rejecting that choice, right? And the same thing with Du Bois. So this idea that to be both African and American, right, that we can't hold those two things in tension without having to fully assimilate. If you go further in the chapter, Cornel West, who you remember from the very beginning of the class, definitely disagrees with having to make that choice, as does Chavez, right, within Mexican American philosophy. And then certainly Anzaldúa would disagree, right, with having to make that particular choice. And the Hughes poem, I think, makes an argument for that as well. But I think there's very strong arguments to be made that one should fully assimilate, and very strong arguments to be made that for certain groups, perhaps separation is what is healthiest and what will bring the most justice and flourishing, perhaps even in the short time. So there's different options there in the chapter for you if you want to take that one on. But just remember when you're looking in the textbook, and there's even an example of a deductive argument, the disjunctive syllogism, either this or this, right? Either assimilation or separation. Just keep in mind that there is that third option to, call fallacy and call false dilemma on that particular pairing, okay? Remember to give a clear thesis statement, right? Identify your two thinkers. If it's not a particular person, it could be a theory or a tradition. I think one of the it's the Justice in Buganda, right? That wouldn't be a particular person. It would be a community, which actually fits well because that idea of justice is that it's community-based and consensus-based. So it's not always a particular thinker. But whichever one is the strongest, I need to know in that introduction, right, I'm arguing for this position. This is the stronger of the two. And so that way you kind of build everything around that. So again, if you are interested in the option B, the Anzaldúa, you can kind of make her work with that assimilation separation question, but there's other claims that she makes that you could argue for or against, and that would make a really interesting argumentative essay as well if you're into her work. All right, if you have any other questions about good examples that you could use throughout, there's a lot going on right now that you could use. You could use COVID, especially when you're talking about just society. You could use sort of Black Lives Matter, any kind of directive action. You can use the San Antonio video, things around education, infrastructure, right, access to healthcare. All this stuff could be used on the what makes justice question. So think about how you can pull in stuff that matters to you, and that might also help you start thinking about a final project topic as well. All right, thanks.